Harlem, June 12, 1959, 14:23. Inside the barbershop, the scent of bay rum masks a deadly chemical. Cecil, a barber of 15 years, holds a straight razor to the king's throat, while a syndicate poison waits in his palm. They expected a routine execution. They found a sovereign whose senses were sharpened by decades of war. Before the blade could bite, Bumpy Johnson delivered a surgical verdict that turned the floor into a crime scene. The syndicate held the son, but Bumpy held the life of the father. To witness the 48-hour hunt for the man who sold his soul, the story begins now. The straight razor scraped across Bumpy Johnson's jawline with the rhythm of a metronome counting down to execution. Cecil's hand moved through the ritual he had performed 6,000 times in 15 years behind the chair. The blade sang its metallic hymn against stubble. The barber chair exhaled leather and age beneath 200 pounds of Harlem authority. Steam lifted from the hot towel draped across the king's chest, like fog rising from a crime scene before the body cools. Bay rum and talcum powder owned the air. Outside the plate glass window, Lenox Avenue cooked under heat that made dogs retreat to shadow and made reasonable men contemplate unreasonable actions. Inside, Sam Cooke whispered from a radio set to a volume that suggested confession rather than entertainment. 3 men occupied the wooden bench. Willie Crawford held the Amsterdam News without reading it. Marcus Bell studied the grain of the floorboards. A third man, whose name carried no weight, watched the second hand make its rotation. 14:23 became 14:24, became 14:25. Time advanced like a prosecution building its case. Cecil reached for the aftershave bottle. Green glass caught afternoon light filtering through the window. The label claimed Bay Rum in faded gold script, but when his fingers wrapped around the neck and tilted the contents toward Bumpy's throat, something in the chemistry announced itself before the liquid could touch skin. The scent climbed into the air with the urgency of a warning flare. Chemical. Foreign. Wrong. Bumpy's eyes remained closed, but his nostrils flared with the precision of an animal detecting poison in still water. "Let me see that." 4 words. No volume. No threat. Just declarative fact, delivered in a voice that made the 3 men on the bench understand that observation had ended and judgment had begun. The silence that followed carried the weight of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its track. Cecil's hand trembled. The bottle shook. Liquid mercury of guilt sloshed against glass. In his left palm, concealed since dawn, when he had doctored the bottle in his basement while his wife slept upstairs, waited the compound. Clear as glycerin, caustic as regret. The chemical burned against his skin with the same intensity that 3 weeks of terror had burned through his spine. Cecil was 41, father to Jerome, husband to Ruth, Baptist, veteran of nothing except the war between paying rent and keeping dignity. He cut hair because his own father had cut hair, and because Harlem trusted men whose hands stayed steady near the throat. For 15 years, those hands had never wavered. For 15 years, he had maintained the sanctuary where Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes and lowered his guard once per week, like clockwork. This was not hatred driving the tremor in his wrist. Hatred required energy Cecil had exhausted during 72 sleepless hours. This was desperation wearing a barber's apron. This was a father watching his son's future crumble into a cell at Rikers because 2 ounces of heroin appeared beneath a car seat, like evidence planted by men who plant evidence for profit. 14:26 arrived. Each second became a courtroom. Each heartbeat became testimony. The radio continued its broadcast, oblivious to the trial unfolding 6 feet from its speaker. Bumpy opened his eyes. His face held the expression granite holds. No anger, no surprise. just the fundamental coldness of a man who had survived 43 years in a profession where most practitioners died before 30. The air in the barbershop shifted density. Willie Crawford's newspaper folded itself with movements suggesting preparation for work other than reading. Marcus Bell's hand drifted toward the small of his back where a .38 waited beneath summer linen. The third man stood without being told to stand. Cecil advanced half a step. The distance between Barber and King compressed to nothing. They occupied the same 6 inches of atmosphere where loyalty meets betrayal, where desperation meets calculation, where a good man discovers that choosing between his son's life and another man's death requires no philosophy at all. Bumpy's right hand struck like a snake testing the temperature of prey. Fingers locked around Cecil's wrist with pressure that collapsed the radial artery. Circulation stopped. The hand holding the doctored bottle went white as Cecil's ulna bent under grip that suggested bone could be powdered if necessary. Bumpy's left hand drove into Cecil's palm, prying open fingers that had already released their resistance. The compound pooled in Cecil's hand like confession made liquid. Bumpy inverted the aftershave bottle and poured. What followed erased the distinction between scream and siren. Cecil's throat produced a sound that belonged to slaughterhouses and emergency rooms, to places where flesh separates from bone under circumstances beyond anesthesia. The chemical contacted skin and began its education. Tissue bubbled. Epidermis peeled back from dermis the way paint peels from wood left too long in acid rain. The reaction generated heat. The heat generated smoke. The smoke carried a stench that combined burning copper with charred pork, a smell that announced consequences with the finality of a coroner's signature. Bumpy released the wrist. Cecil collapsed onto checkerboard tile that had supported 15 years of respectability before this Friday stripped it away. The king stepped backward, adjusted his necktie with fingers that demonstrated no tremor, and rolled his cuffs to mid-forearm with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for a procedure requiring precision rather than speed. He surveyed the 3 men who had abandoned any pretense that this afternoon remained ordinary. "Anyone else need a shave?" Silence answered. The radio ignored the question and advanced to its next selection. Sam Cooke transitioned from chain gangs to love songs which felt obscene given the classroom instruction occurring 6 feet from the speaker. Bumpy crossed to the entrance and locked the door from inside. He rotated the hanging sign from open to closed. Then he drew the curtain across the plate glass window, sealing the barbershop from Lenox Avenue's heat and Lenox Avenue's witness. When he turned back to face the room, his expression carried the neutrality of a magistrate reading a verdict already determined by evidence too substantial to dispute. To understand why Cecile, 15 years clean son and accounting school wife in the church choir, hands steady enough to hold razors near carotid arteries, attempted to kill Bumpy. Johnson requires returning 3 weeks prior. Back to May 22nd, when Jerome's Chevrolet stopped for a traffic light on 125th Street, and 2 police officers approached with a narrative already written and evidence already planted beneath the driver's seat. May 22, 1959. 22:17. Jerome's Chevrolet Bel Air rolled to a stop at the intersection of 125th and Lenox when the traffic light cycled red. The tail lamp on the passenger side had been dark since Wednesday. Jerome had noticed it Thursday morning, but night school consumed his evenings, and the repair shop closed before his accounting class ended. Small oversights produce large consequences in neighborhoods where police patrol with quotas instead of purpose. The squad car materialized in his rearview mirror with the inevitability of tax collection. 2 officers emerged. Rizzo took the driver's side. Palmieri circled to the passenger door like a flanking maneuver rehearsed in precincts, where arrest statistics determine promotion schedules. Rizzo requested license and registration with the courtesy of a man performing theater for an audience that did not exist. Jerome complied. His hands stayed visible on the steering wheel the way his father had taught him before he was old enough to drive. Palmieri's flashlight beam cut through the interior. The search began under the pretense of broken equipment requiring safety inspection. Palmieri's hand disappeared beneath the driver's seat. When it emerged, 2 ounces of heroin wrapped in butcher paper sat in his palm, like evidence that had been waiting for discovery since before Jerome started the ignition. Jerome was 23, student at City College night program. Employment at a wholesale textile warehouse where he counted inventory and balanced ledgers. No gambling, no narcotics, no associations with enterprises that operated beyond legal boundaries. His record consisted of a parking violation from 1957 and a library fine paid 3 days late. The kind of clean that makes frame jobs simple because juries believe police over defendants who match a particular description. The attorney Cecil hired came from a downtown firm with mahogany furniture and secretaries who answered phones in voices that suggested private schools. His assessment arrived with the clinical detachment of a coroner announcing findings. The evidence was immaculate. Too immaculate. The packaging showed no fingerprints. The placement under the seat demonstrated the geometry of professional staging. The officer's testimony would synchronize with the precision of a rehearsed script. The jury would need 40 minutes to convict, because 12 citizens selected from voter rolls do not question men with badges when the defendant's complexion matches their preconceptions. 15 years minimum, 25 maximum. Federal sentencing guidelines for possession with intent to distribute. The numbers landed on Cecil's chest like concrete blocks dropped from a rooftop. 15 years converted Jerome's 23 into 38. It transformed accounting aspirations into warehouse labor. It rewrote a future that had been built on night classes and discipline into a history that ended in a cell at Attica, where rehabilitation meant survival and education meant learning which gangs controlled which corridors. Cecil received the news standing in his kitchen at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, while Ruth wept into a dish towel and the attorney's briefcase clicked shut with the finality of a vault door sealing. Sunday morning. 10:45. Abyssinian Baptist Church released its congregation into sunlight that felt obscene given the circumstances. Cecil descended the granite steps with Ruth holding his arm, like a widow supporting a husband at a funeral. The choir's final hymn still hung in the air, mixing with the smell of starched cotton and the perfume that respectable women wore to demonstrate their distance from the streets. Sal Mancini waited beside a Cadillac, the color of a hearse. He wore a suit that cost more than Cecil earned in 3 months. His posture suggested patience acquired through professions where waiting preceded violence. When Cecil's eyes met his, Mancini pushed off the fender with the languid confidence of a man who owned time because he owned fear. "Walk with me." 2 words. No request. Just instruction delivered in a tone that made Ruth's grip tighten on Cecil's forearm. They walked. Away from the church. Away from the crowd dispersing toward Sunday dinners. Toward the small park where children played on swings that squeaked like confession booth doors. Mancini's credentials arrived in a voice that turned names into weapons. Rizzo reports to Captain Brennan. Brennan takes envelopes from Paulie Torino. Torino answers to Vito Genovese. He recited the chain of command like a maitre d', reading a menu, each name a course in the meal of institutional corruption that fed on Harlem like a parasite that had learned to call itself law enforcement. From his jacket pocket, Mancini produced a small glass vial. The powder inside caught sunlight and refracted it into colors that had no place in conversations, occurring 50 yards from a house of worship. Medical grade, sodium hydroxide with accelerant. Apply it correctly, the target requires reconstructive surgery. Apply it incorrectly, the target requires a closed casket. Your choice depends on how steady your hands are when the moment arrives. Genovese controlled the heroin trade from East Harlem to the Bronx. His organization processed imports through docks in Brooklyn, distributed through apartments in the Lower East Side, and collected debts with methods that made bankruptcy preferable to default. Men who owed Genovese money disappeared into the foundation of construction projects. Women who testified against Genovese associates retracted statements after house fires consumed everything except their capacity for revised memory. Sal Mancini earned his initial in the organization's hierarchy through proficiency, with straight razors applied to faces, hands, and anatomical regions where scarring produced permanent psychological revision. Bumpy Johnson sits in your chair every Friday, 14:30. Clockwork. You put this in his aftershave. You apply it to his face. You walk away. Jerome's charges vanish by Monday morning. Evidence gets lost. Witnesses forget. The prosecutor discovers urgent business in another jurisdiction. Mancini returned the vial to his pocket. Genovese is expanding operations. Harlem represents opportunity. Johnson represents obstacle. You represent solution. The children on the swings continued their arc through air. Their laughter provided soundtrack to negotiation that turned fatherhood into weapon and desperation into recruitment tool. Cecil's throat constricted around words that refused formation. His lungs pulled air that tasted like copper and ash. Mancini's hand settled on Cecil's shoulder with the weight of a judge's gavel. I understand hesitation. You are a good man. Good men make difficult decisions when circumstances leave no alternative. His fingers tightened. Not painful, just insistent. Consider what happens to good men's sons in Attica. Consider what happens when protective custody fails. Consider what happens when accidents occur in shower rooms because guards were attending to duties in other cell blocks. Mancini established the timeline with the precision of an execution schedule. Friday, 14:30, your regular appointment. Genovese requires confirmation by 1600 hours. Failure to deliver produces consequences for Jerome that begin Saturday and continue until his sentence completes or his heart stops, whichever arrives first. The specific threats followed with the casual brutality of a menu listing daily specials. Falls down stairs that shatter vertebrae. Car accidents where brake lines fail on vehicles recently inspected. Gas leaks in apartments where detectors malfunction despite installation by certified technicians. Kitchen fires that start in walls and spread faster than elderly occupants can navigate to exits. Each scenario delivered in Mancini's voice carried the authenticity of methods previously employed, documented in police reports that concluded with determinations of accidental causation. Ruth would be first. Not Jerome. Ruth. Because murdering the son provided mercy compared to forcing the father to attend his wife's funeral. Knowing her kitchen burning was retaliation for his refusal to comply with instructions delivered beside a playground on Sunday morning. Mancini departed without handshake or farewell. The Cadillac pulled from the curb with the smooth acceleration of a vehicle maintained by people who understood that mechanical failure was unacceptable when conducting business requiring punctuality. Cecil stood in sunlight that felt like interrogation room lighting. The vial in his pocket radiated presence despite weighing less than an ounce. It pressed against his ribs like a tumor that had metastasized from external circumstance into internal certainty. 6 nights followed. Sleep became theoretical concept discussed by people whose sons faced merely ordinary futures. Cecil lay in darkness, listening to Ruth's breathing and calculating the mathematics of impossible equations. Save Jerome by killing Bumpy. Refuse Mancini and watch Ruth burn. Every variable led to casualty. Every solution required sacrifice. The algebra of desperation produces answers that appear logical only to men trapped in problems where all exits terminate in graves. The vial sat on his workbench in the basement. At night it seemed to generate its own illumination, a cold phosphorescence that belonged to materials designed for purposes beyond legitimate chemistry. Cecil had mixed it into the bay rum bottle Wednesday evening, while Ruth attended choir practice and Jerome studied for examinations he would never complete if his father chose incorrectly. Friday morning arrived with the punctuality of a firing squad assembling at dawn. Cecil opened the barbershop at 0800. He swept floors that did not need sweeping. He arranged tools that required no arrangement. He waited for 14:30 the way condemned men wait for governor's calls that do not arrive. The bottle sat on the counter. Green glass. Gold label. Contents modified. A father's love converted into chemical weapon, because men in expensive suits understood that desperation transforms civilians into assassins when the hostage has your surname and your features and calls you father in a voice that still cracks when emotion overwhelms vocabulary. The barbershop represented neutral ground in territory where neutral ground did not exist. Men sat in the chair and closed their eyes because the chair demanded trust, and trust demanded vulnerability. Kings removed their crowns. The straight razor at the throat became ritual rather than threat because 15 years of consistency had built covenant stronger than contracts. Betrayal in this space did not constitute tactical failure. It announced that sovereignty had limits, and limits invited challenge. Cecil confessed on the checkerboard floor while his palm continued its chemical education. The words came between screams diminished into whimpers. Mancini. Genovese. Jerome framed with heroin planted beneath a car seat. The choice presented as binary poison Bumpy, or watch your son convert 23 into 38 behind Attica walls. Rizzo and Palmieri executing the traffic stop with rehearsed coordination. The vial delivered beside a playground on Sunday morning, while children rode swings. Bumpy listened with the expression a coroner wears documenting cause. No interruption. No visible reaction. Just methodical absorption of information to be converted into action. When Cecil finished, Bumpy walked to the sink and washed his hands with surgical thoroughness. He dried each finger individually. He rolled his sleeves to precise points below the elbow. I know Harlem. 3 words. Declarative fact delivered in a voice that made the 3 witnesses understand that knowledge represented currency more valuable than Genovese's heroin profits. Bumpy knew which police took envelopes and which judges accepted considerations. He knew which politicians attended Little Italy fundraisers and which labor unions employed men whose resumes featured skill sets beyond collective bargaining. But knowledge did not erase the fundamental transgression. Cecil possessed the same information. Cecil knew Bumpy maintained infrastructure designed to address problems where law enforcement represented obstacle rather than solution. Instead of walking 3 blocks to request audience, Cecil had accepted Mancini's vial and mixed it into bay rum and waited for Friday to arrive with murder disguised as grooming. You did not come to me. Bumpy's jaw set with vault door rigidity. The statement required no elaboration. It contained verdict and sentence compressed into 5 syllables. Bumpy crossed to the telephone. He dialed with deliberate precision. The first call reached Juno Williams at the Lenox Lounge. Instructions arrived in sentences containing no excess words. Secure the perimeter. No one enters. No one leaves. No police receive notification until the scene has been managed. The second call reached Dr. Hayes, whose medical license permitted treatment of injuries occurring in circumstances where hospital admission invited questions benefiting neither patient nor practitioner. Marcus Bell locked the front door. Willie Crawford moved Cecil to the back room. The third man remained at the window watching for squad cars that might arrive ahead of schedule. Infiltration began with identification of pressure points in systems designed to appear impermeable. Bumpy maintained assets inside the precinct house on 135th. A file clerk whose gambling debts had been restructured in exchange for access to arrest reports before they reached official channels. A desk sergeant whose mortgage payments arrived with consistency his salary could not explain. The records clerk would pull Jerome's arrest report, photocopy the evidence log, document which officers signed the chain of custody. The desk sergeant would monitor holding cell assignments and visitor logs. Every bureaucratic artifact left fingerprints. Every signature represented a person. Every person possessed vulnerabilities waiting for exploitation. Bumpy dispatched runners to the tombs where Jerome sat in pre-trial detention. Eyes would be positioned. Who visited? Who asked questions? Which guards accepted gratuities for delivering messages circumventing official mail protocols? Mancini had drawn a map when he threatened Ruth with kitchen fires and Jerome with shower room accidents. That map now became tactical intelligence. The back room converted into command center. Bumpy sat at the small desk where Cecil balanced ledgers. A yellow legal pad appeared, a mechanical pencil, the telephone directory. Coffee brewed on the hot plate went cold got ignored. The smell of burned grounds mixed with bay rum and lingering chemical residue. Names went onto paper in handwriting, demonstrating institutional education. Rizzo, Palmieri, Brennan, Torino, Mancini, Genovese. The organizational chart of corruption took shape in graphite on yellow paper. Lines connected names. Question marks indicated relationships requiring confirmation. Each notation represented leverage waiting for application. Bumpy understood that power functioned through mechanisms more sophisticated than ammunition. Bullets solved immediate problems, but produced escalation. They invited retaliation. They converted business disputes into wars where victory required resources depleting faster than they could be replenished. Intelligent operators identified pressure points making bullets unnecessary. The file clerk produced documentation within 4 hours. The arrest report contained inconsistencies invisible to prosecutors, but glaring to trained readers. The timestamp on the traffic stop occurred 11 minutes before Rizzo and Palmieri logged their patrol route entering that sector. The evidence bag's serial number belonged to a batch issued to a different precinct 3 months prior. Rizzo's weakness wore a wedding ring. His wife attended Mass at St. Charles Borromeo every morning. She believed her husband worked nights protecting citizens. She did not know about the envelope he collected from Torino's lieutenant every Thursday at a diner on Arthur Avenue. Photographs of that exchange would be devastating, not legally. But marriages built on deception collapsed when deception became visible. Palmieri frequented a poker game in the back room of a social club on Pleasant Avenue. Thursday nights, stakes exceeding his monthly salary, losses accumulating faster than his ability to service them through legitimate earnings. Men who lose at poker games run by Genovese eventually receive offers that include terms. Planting evidence qualified as assignment. Brennan maintained a mistress in a rent-controlled apartment on the Upper West Side. The lease listed a shell corporation. The lady believed Brennan was divorced. His actual wife believed he worked late filing paperwork. Both women would be interested to learn about the other's existence. Bumpy compiled the dossier with prosecutorial thoroughness. Each vulnerability documented, each pressure point identified, each lever positioned for application. The goal was not destruction. The goal was realignment. Make them understand that their arrangement with Genovese cost more than it paid. The opponent believed they held a hostage. They had Jerome in a cell and Cecil in a corner, and Bumpy targeted for disfigurement. But hostages only provided leverage when the other party lacked alternatives. The opponent held a son. Bumpy held the truth. Vito Genovese had been studying the map of Manhattan with the attention conquistadors gave to coastlines before landing. Harlem represented the final unconquered province in an empire stretching from the Bronx to Brooklyn, from the docks where heroin arrived in furniture crates to the tenements where it disappeared into veins and profit margins. The Jerome frame job served as reconnaissance, test the defenses, measure the response time. If Bumpy Johnson allowed a random college student to rot in pretrial detention, it signaled weakness. Weakness invited expansion. 24 hours remained before Jerome's case transferred from arrest report to formal indictment. Once the district attorney filed charges, the machinery of prosecution became irreversible. Bumpy understood that Genovese had engineered the deadline deliberately. Panic produces mistakes. Mistakes produce opportunities. If Bumpy negotiated, he admitted vulnerability. If he retaliated with violence, He started a war, turning Harlem into contested ground. If he did nothing, every small operator from the Bronx to Queens would recognize that the king permitted his subjects to be framed without consequence. The tax collectors would arrive by Monday. Bumpy made 3 telephone calls. The first went to a restaurant on Mulberry Street. The second went to a lawyer whose practice involved clients preferring conversations outside official buildings. The third went to a location requiring disclosure only when conversation demanded it. The meeting occurred in the back room of Rouse at 2200 hours Saturday. The restaurant had closed to civilian traffic an hour prior. The front door remained locked. The dining room sat empty except for tables set with white cloth and wine glasses awaiting Sunday dinner service. Duke Ellington drifted from the radio in the corner volume set low enough that conversation remained possible. The back room smelled of Barolo breathing in a decanter since sundown. 2 glasses sat on the table, both empty. The wine waited for participants who had not yet determined whether this gathering would conclude with toasts or silence. Sal Mancini arrived first, accompanied by 2 men whose function was evident from the way their jackets hung heavy on the left side. He took the chair facing the door with automatic positioning of a man trained to monitor exits. Bumpy entered alone. No bodyguards. No visible weapons. He took the chair with his back to the door, a decision announcing either supreme confidence or supreme indifference to conventional security protocols. Bumpy reached for the decanter and poured 2 glasses with chemist's deliberation. He slid one across the table. Mancini did not touch it. Rizzo takes his envelope Thursdays at 1400 hours. Arthur Avenue. Booth in the back. He orders coffee. Drinks half. Leaves $8 for a $1 check. Bumpy's voice carried the neutral tone of a meteorologist reciting forecast data. Palmieri plays poker, Pleasant Avenue Social Club. He lost 4,000 last month. The month before 6. Men who lose that consistently at tables run by your organization eventually receive offers including debt forgiveness in exchange for services rendered. Mancini's jaw tightened. Captain Brennan maintains a woman on West 81st Street, apartment 4C. His wife attends Mass at St. Patrick's every Sunday. 4th pew from the front, right side. She believes her husband works late because the department demands sacrifice. Bumpy lifted his glass but did not drink. These are facts. The question is what we do with facts once they become known to parties with interest in their application. Mancini's hand moved toward his jacket. The 2 men flanking him tensed. Bumpy remained motionless. You have a choice. Jerome's charges disappear by Monday morning. The evidence vanishes. The officers discover urgent reasons to revise their testimony. This outcome preserves your soldiers' marriages, their careers, their freedom from scrutiny, transforming comfortable arrangements into prosecutable conspiracies. Bumpy set the glass down untouched. Or you proceed with the indictment and discover that facts have audiences beyond this room. Wives. Internal affairs divisions. Federal prosecutors who build careers on police corruption connected to organized crime. Mancini's hand retreated. Genovese does not negotiate with threats. This is not a threat. This is a menu. You select the outcome serving your interests. Bumpy stood. Harlem is not contested territory. It never was. It never will be. You attempted to test that principle using a college student as your instrument. The test has concluded. The results are available for your review. Cecil sat in the back room while Dr. Hayes wrapped his hand in gauze, requiring changing twice daily for 3 weeks. The chemical burn had penetrated to the 2nd dermal layer. The scarring would be permanent. He would never hold a straight razor with the precision required for the profession he had practiced 15 years. Bumpy entered after the doctor departed. He pulled a chair and positioned it 3 feet from where Cecil sat with his bandaged hand resting on his lap. Jerome will be released by Tuesday morning. The charges will be dismissed. The arrest record will be sealed. Bumpy's tone carried the flat neutrality of a judge reading a verdict. I did this because your son is innocent. Innocent people do not deserve punishment for crimes they did not commit. Cecil's throat constricted. You will leave Harlem. Detroit has barbershops needing experienced men. I have made arrangements for employment and housing. You will depart Friday. You will not return for visits. You will not maintain contact with former clients. Bumpy's eyes held the temperature of January steel. You will wake every morning and look in the mirror. The scars on your hand will remind you of the choice you made when presented with an impossible situation. They will remind you that you chose to bring poison into a sanctuary rather than walk 3 blocks to request help from the man you had served for 15 years. Cecil's voice emerged as fractured whisper. I was afraid. Fear is reasonable. Betrayal is unforgivable. Bumpy stood. You will live in a city with many mirrors. Every reflection will serve as your sentence. Bumpy did not need to kill Cecil. The barber would carry his punishment in bandages that would eventually be removed and scars that would never fade. Every morning for the rest of his life, Cecil would wash his face and see in the mirror the man who chose wrong, when choosing right required only the courage to ask for help. Bumpy understood the grammar of power in languages spoken by men who govern through fear rather than statute. Verbal agreements carried weight only when reinforced by physical evidence demonstrating the cost of violation. The meeting at Rouse had established terms. Mancini had departed with understanding that Jerome's charges would dissolve and Harlem would remain unconquered territory. But understanding without consequence produced the illusion of negotiation between equals. Genovese did not negotiate with equals. He absorbed competitors or eliminated obstacles. The choice between those outcomes required clarification, delivered in vocabulary that transcended conversation. 72 hours. The timeline began at 14:23 Friday, when Cecile's hand had received its chemical education, and ended at 14:23 Monday, when the district attorney's office would either file formal charges or discover that evidence had become unavailable for reasons requiring no elaboration. Within that window, the message needed composition delivery and confirmation of receipt. The problem with Mercy was that it invited misinterpretation. Genovese had sent Mancini to Harlem with instructions to test boundaries through the frame job and subsequent assassination attempt. Those instructions had failed to produce desired results. Failure without penalty suggested the instructions had been reasonable and execution had been inadequate. Reasonable instructions would be repeated with different personnel until success occurred, or until the organization attempting them learned that some territories resisted conquest, not through weakness requiring additional pressure, but through strength requiring revised strategy. Bumpy required a period at the end of the sentence, not a comma suggesting pause, not a semicolon implying continuation, a full stop announcing that the conversation had concluded and further discussion would be conducted through methods neither party preferred. Monday morning. 06:30. A 1958 Cadillac Series 62 sat in the parking lot behind Torino's Social Club on Pleasant Avenue. The vehicle had been detailed Saturday afternoon. The chrome gleamed. The white walls showed no scuff marks. The interior smelled of leather conditioner and the cigarettes Mancini preferred Turkish tobacco wrapped in paper that cost more per pack than most men earned per hour. The trunk contained Sal Mancini in a configuration suggesting he had been placed there with consideration for spatial efficiency rather than comfort. His suit remained pressed. His tie remained knotted. His shoes retained their shine. The only disruption to his professional presentation involved his hands, which had been removed at the wrists, with incisions demonstrating surgical precision. The cuts showed the clean edges of someone trained in anatomy or experienced in butchery or sufficiently motivated to study technique before application. No sawing. No hesitation marks. just confident separation of joint from limb executed with tools sharpened to specifications that made bone yield like soft tissue. The hands rested on Mancini's chest, positioned as though in prayer or supplication. Between the severed wrists sat a piece of paper torn from a standard-lined notebook. The handwriting used block capitals suggesting institutional education or deliberate disguise of natural script. 4 words occupied the center of the page. Steady hands require trust. The message required no translation for men fluent in the dialect of organizational consequences. Mancini had delivered the vial to Cecil with instructions to apply chemical compound to Bumpy's face. The hands that had extended that vial no longer connected to arms that could extend anything. The mathematics was simple. The poetry was elegant. The lesson was permanent. Torino's lieutenant discovered the vehicle at 07:15 when arriving to open the club for the cleaning crew. The police received notification at 07:45. The detective who caught the case recognized the signature immediately. This was not random violence. This was correspondence between institutions discussing terms that civilian law enforcement could observe, but not adjudicate. The report would be filed. The investigation would be conducted with the thoroughness that investigations received when everyone involved understood that solving the case would create more problems than leaving it officially unsolved. The file would remain open. The file would produce no arrests. The file would serve as historical record that on June 15, 1959, Sal Mancini's employment with the Genovese organization had been terminated under circumstances suggesting his final performance review had identified deficiencies requiring correction through methods beyond traditional human resources protocols. Tuesday morning, 0900. Jerome walked out of the Tombs through the front entrance rather than the side door used for transfers to Rikers. The charges had been dismissed at 08:30 during a hearing that lasted 4 minutes. The assistant district attorney had appeared before the judge with the expression of a man reading a script he had not written and did not fully understand. The evidence had become unavailable. The chain of custody showed irregularities. The arresting officers had provided conflicting testimony during preliminary interviews. The case lacked merit for prosecution. The judge had asked 2 questions. The prosecutor had provided answers satisfying procedural requirements without addressing the substance underneath the procedure. The gavel had fallen. Jerome had been released on his own recognizance pending formal dismissal, which had occurred before he reached the courthouse steps. Cecil waited on the sidewalk with Ruth holding his arm and tears running down her face in lines that carved through makeup applied that morning, with hands that had trembled during application. Jerome embraced his mother. He shook his father's unbandaged hand. He did not ask questions about the bandage covering the other hand, because young men raised in Harlem understood that some questions produced answers that increased burden rather than reduce uncertainty. Officer Rizzo received transfer orders Wednesday morning. His new assignment placed him in a precinct in Staten Island, where his skill set could be applied to populations less likely to generate complications, requiring explanations to supervisors who preferred simple narratives. Officer Palmieri discovered Thursday that his gambling debts had been purchased by a collection agency operating outside traditional financial institutions. The agency offered payment plans featuring interest rates and enforcement mechanisms that made default inadvisable. Captain Brennan learned Friday that his wife had received an anonymous letter containing information about an apartment on West 81st Street. The divorce proceedings would be filed within the month. Genovese received the message with the clarity reserved for communications delivered in vocabulary impossible to misinterpret. Harlem would not be paying tribute. The policy banks would not redirect earnings downtown. The numbers runners would not acknowledge new management. The heroin distribution network would not expand north of 110th Street without invitation that would not be extended. The test had been conducted. The results had been documented. The conclusion required no further discussion. Harlem remained quiet Tuesday afternoon. Not the quiet of submission, the quiet of a jurisdiction governed by laws that operated independent of municipal codes and federal statutes. the quiet of a territory where sovereignty was not granted by election or appointment, but earned through the willingness to defend boundaries against men who believed boundaries existed only until someone with sufficient force decided otherwise. Bumpy Johnson sat in his new barber's chair Thursday at 14:30. Theodore, the replacement barber, held the straight razor with hands that demonstrated competence, but lacked the 15 years of familiarity that had existed with Cecil. The hot towel rested on Bumpy's chest. The bay rum sat on the counter in a bottle that had never been opened before that morning. The radio played low. The afternoon sun cut through the window at the same angle it had cut the previous Thursday, and would cut the following Thursday, and every Thursday after, until the building was demolished or the sun changed its trajectory. The king closed his eyes. The razor made its journey across his jawline. The silence in the barbershop carried weight that required no explanation for men who understood that power speaks loudest when it requires no volume at all. Detroit, August 1959. Cecil rented a two-bedroom apartment on the east side where buildings showed their age in cracked foundation and peeling paint. The neighborhood smelled of factory exhaust and the resignation that settles over districts where ambition had been replaced by survival. He found work at a barbershop on Reshaped Avenue where clientele consisted of assembly line workers who paid $3 for cuts requiring no conversation. Every morning, Cecil stood before the bathroom mirror and conducted inventory. The scar tissue on his right palm had formed keloids that pulled skin tight when he attempted to close his fist. The ridges caught light like topographical maps documenting terrain where chemistry had rewritten biology. He could hold a comb. He could operate clippers, but the straight razor remained in its case beneath folded towels. Jerome completed his degree at Wayne State. He passed his CPA examination first attempt. He accepted a position at an accounting firm downtown, where his starting salary exceeded what Cecil had earned during his best year in Harlem. Father and son shared the apartment and maintained civility that never crossed into territory where trust rebuilds after betrayal. The wall between them had been constructed from materials more durable than brick. Ruth cooked dinner every evening at 1800 hours. They sat at a table purchased second-hand from a widow selling her husband's possessions. They discussed weather and news and the Tigers' pennant prospects. They did not discuss New York. They did not discuss the barbershop on Lenox Avenue. They did not discuss the Friday in June when chemistry had turned a father's hand into permanent reminder that desperate men make choices haunting them longer than the circumstances that produce desperation. The barbershop on Lenox Avenue underwent renovation during summer. The checkerboard floor was replaced with vinyl tile, suggesting modernity rather than tradition. The barber chairs were reupholstered in burgundy leather with no history. The mirrors were replaced with new glass reflecting images without distortion, accumulated over decades. The radio was upgraded to a model featuring FM reception. The owners had attempted to erase the incident through cosmetic intervention. But atmospheres possess memory independent of physical components. The new floor made different sounds. The new chairs adjusted with unfamiliar mechanisms. The space felt sanitized in ways extending beyond literal meaning. Theodore became primary barber after renovation completed. 28. Trained at a technical school in the Bronx. Competent with clippers, adequate with scissors. His hands trembled slightly during his first week worsening when Bumpy arrived for his Thursday 14:30 appointment. Bumpy settled into the chair. Theodore draped the cloth with movements suggesting rehearsal, but lacking muscle memory, converting routine into ritual. His hand shook, reaching for scissors. The tremor was subtle but visible. Everyone paid attention. "Relax." Bumpy's voice carried no threat, just observation. Theodore's breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped. The tremor diminished to levels consistent with normal physiology, rather than fear-making hands unstable near carotid arteries. The hot towel went on. Theodore reached for the bay rum. Bumpy's hand intercepted the bottle before it could be opened. He unscrewed the cap himself. He tilted it toward his nose and inhaled with sommelier deliberation. The scent registered as expected. Bay rum, alcohol, menthol, nothing foreign. Bumpy returned the bottle with a nod, converting inspection into protocol. The new ritual had been established. Every Thursday. Every bottle. Every application would be preceded by verification performed by the person whose skin would receive it. Trust would no longer be assumed. It would be confirmed through procedures making assumptions unnecessary. The throne requires guardians' understanding that holding a razor means holding a life where severance occurs through millimeters of pressure, applied incorrectly or intentionally. Theodore learned this through observation. He watched Bumpy inspect the bay rum every Thursday. He noticed how Willie Crawford and Marcus Bell positioned themselves near the door. He recognized that the barbershop had transformed from sanctuary into secured facility where rituals continued, but trust had been replaced by verification. 6 months after the incident, Theodore asked the question forming since his first day. "Why do you still come here?" Bumpy considered the question while Theodore worked the razor along his jawline. "Because men need places where they can close their eyes. The world requires too much vigilance. We carve out spaces where vigilance can rest. When those spaces are violated, we have 2 choices: abandon them or reclaim them. Abandonment is easier. Reclamation is necessary." The story of Cecil and the poisoned bay rum became legend in Harlem. The details shifted with each retelling, but the core remained consistent. A barber had been presented with an impossible choice and had chosen wrong. The consequence had been permanent. The lesson had been absorbed. Real power does not announce itself through volume or spectacle. It operates through quiet certainty that actions produce consequences, and consequences reshape behavior more effectively than threats. Bumpy had not needed to kill Cecil or Jerome or Ruth. He had needed to demonstrate that betrayal carried costs, exceeding the temporary relief it provided. Harlem remained unconquered, not because it lacked value, but because the cost of taking it exceeded the profits extractable after paying that cost. The king sat in his throne every Thursday at 14:30. The razor made its journey. The silence carried the weight of sovereignty maintained through intelligence rather than ammunition. Power is not the willingness to use violence. Power is the wisdom to make violence unnecessary through strategic application of consequences, teaching lessons remembered longer than the pain that delivered them. The question is not who you are willing to save. The question is what price you are willing to pay, and whether you possess the courage to ask for help before desperation converts you into the instrument of your own destruction. The blade at Cecile's throat was never about bay rum or chemistry. It was about the silence before asking for help. In boardrooms and courtrooms and kitchen tables, where impossible choices wait, the question remains. Do you bring poison to the problem, or do you walk 3 blocks to find the person who already knows the solution? Bumpy Johnson understood that power is not violence. Power is the network you build before crisis arrives. The barber who chose isolation over alliance spent the rest of his life studying scars in Detroit mirrors. This story represents historical interpretation for educational purposes. The events described should not be considered prescriptive for modern conflict resolution. So here is the question for you. What sanctuary in your life are you protecting alone when walking 3 blocks could transform isolation into alliance? Write your answer in the comments. Your story matters. Thank you for staying until the final frame. If this story changed how you see power and trust, press that like button, subscribe so you catch the next case when it drops, share.